All right, you may be seated. All right, Ms. Sampson, you may resume.
Thank you, Your Honor.
No, thank you.
Okay, just a couple more questions about the chart that's up right now. Where did Hemy typically function on this chart?
He typically functioned, if I could point, like right up here.
If you point to slightly to the right or the left, so you're not over the colors, I think it will be
Okay,
clearer.
let me try this. Can you see the dot?
Well,
Like right around there.
okay.
In other words, he functioned, his normal mood tended to be a little bit on the hypomanic side. And by that I mean he's somebody that tends to function to be able to do a lot more than more people with not necessarily as much need for sleep and whatnot. So his mood tends to function between sort of normal and hypomanic.
Okay, so if I
A little bit
say-
more hypomanic.
So same old Hemy, typical Hemy, that's going to be at that level.
Correct. You won't see where you'll see a difference is if he, or you may see a difference is if he goes from depression to hypomania. But with depression, it depends again on the symptoms. Unless they become suicidal and need to be hospitalized, you may not realize that the individual is depressed, especially if they are somebody that tends to keep their feelings bottled up, or if they're somebody that tends to be more private.
Now, is there anything about the timing, in other words, moving from depression to mania, is there anything about the timing that's important?
Yes, there's a couple of things. First of all, once an individual experiences a severe depressive episode or a manic episode, they are more likely to re-experience one again. So having been on either opposite end of the spectrum will make you more vulnerable if you have bipolar disorder to going in that route again, either going really low or really high again. So that's number one. And then the other thing is that if you're going from let's say a severe depression and you're coming out of it, and if you got to the point of severe depression, you're also at higher risk of going from severe depression, jumping all the way to more of a manic episode, not necessarily normal. You can sometimes go from severe to sort of normal balanced mood, but if you are at opposite ends of the spectrum, you're at a higher risk of going completely catapulting, if you will, and going completely in the opposite direction, from one extreme to the other.
Thank you. You had touched on this, but can you explain how psychosis relates to the diagnosis here?
Certainly. So in a manic episode, the way we will know an individual is manic is either their functioning is in fact impaired. So they are having difficulties at work because they're all over the place, or socially they're doing things that are much more risky, that are putting them in danger. For example, let's say having indiscriminate sex with lots and lots of people. So their functioning can be impacted. It doesn't necessarily have to be impacted. I alluded earlier to sometimes we also know that somebody's experiencing a manic episode, obviously, if they require hospitalization because they are, as I alluded to earlier, for example, a risk to others because of their irritability and their agitation. Or we can also say that they are in a manic episode if not necessarily if their functioning is not impaired. It doesn't have to be. They don't have to require hospitalization. But if we see what we call psychotic features, that automatically makes it manic episode. So it can be one of those three things present for us to say, as clinicians, the person is in a manic episode. And it is my opinion that with Mr. Neuman, at the time that the offense was committed, he was experiencing psychotic features.
And is psychosis something that you often see in bipolar disorder?
Actually, yes. The research tells us that there is a 50 to 90% lifetime prevalence rate of psychosis in individuals with bipolar disorder. Doesn't mean everybody experiences psychosis if they have bipolar disorder, but it means that over the lifetime rate, we will see 50 to 90% of them may experience a psychotic break. It doesn't necessarily mean they remain psychotic, but it means that they can experience some sort of psychotic episode. In psychotic episode, I mean loss of touch with reality.
Now let's talk a little bit about psychosis. You said it's a loss of touch with reality. How does that show up?
So the loss of touch with reality, do I have one that talks about hallucinations at all or not?
No.
Okay. Before we talk about this one, can we talk about hallucinations?
Yeah. I object. The question should come from the attorney to the witness, so I'd ask that the narrative stop and that the witness respond to questions.
I don't mean to sustain that objection. You have on record examination. Please ask questions, Ms. Sampson.
Okay, let me, are hallucinations a part of psychosis?
It is. Hallucinations are typically what we tend to see in psychosis, which is hallucinations are, they can vary. The ones that we will typically have reported to us are either an individual is hearing things that are not real, that are not there, so that's called auditory hallucinations, or they may experience visual hallucinations, seeing things that are not real, but that feel very real to the individual. And that is what makes it a loss of touch with reality, that to them, to the individual experiencing hallucinations, the voices very much feel real as you can hear me right now talking with you. The visual hallucinations are very, very real as you can see me talking with you right now. And that is how real it feels to the individual that has experiencing psychosis. There's other symptoms that can also be seen in psychosis. The ones that relate to Mr. Neuman are the hallucinations, and then we have something called delusions.
Okay. Let me stop you while we're on hallucinations. Do you also see hallucinations in patients with schizophrenia or other mental illnesses?
You do. Schizophrenia is the disorder that I think when people think of the word crazy, they tend to think they're probably thinking of individuals with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a severe form of mental illness, as bipolar disorder can be. And with schizophrenia, one of the classic core symptoms is that individuals will experience the hallucinations. They can experience what we call paranoid delusions. What makes the hallucinations in somebody with schizophrenia, I think, a little different from hallucinations in somebody with bipolar disorder is the severity and the chronicity. By that I mean somebody with schizophrenia tends to hear the voices a lot more frequent. The severity of them will be much more. So this is where you see, for example, individuals that are mentally ill that may be talking to themselves. They are in fact not talking to themselves. They are in fact likely responding to somebody that they think is talking to them, but that is not real. And typically, when you see that, it tends to be something like schizophrenia. So the voices tend to be more prevalent, more present, last longer. Versus with bipolar disorder, the severity, the research tells us, is actually when they do occur, the level of severity is less so than you would see in schizophrenia. So with bipolar disorder, it may be just one or two things that they hear, and then that's it. It resolves.
Now, can you talk about delusions? Can you define delusions?
Sure. Delusions is another type of psychosis, and delusions are beliefs that are not real, but that the individual feel very real, and they are what we call very resistant to change. It is a belief. It is an irrational, illogical, makes no sense belief to the normal human being, to somebody that's not experiencing it. But to the person that is experiencing a delusion, it actually, there's nothing to question. It is their reality. It is what they feel. It is what they believe in. And there's no convincing them that they've got it wrong, because they will always find ways of convincing you, of trying to convince you how, in fact, no, they are right. So, for example, I think the delusion that most people are familiar with is paranoid delusions. Oh, you're paranoid. Well, individuals, when they become psychotic, they can experience, actually, some people experience what's called paranoid delusions. So they may think a paranoid delusion might involve somebody believing that that their next door neighbor wants to poison them, and they're convinced. And so if the next door neighbor brings brownies, they're not going to eat the brownies because they think that they're going to be poisoned. And there's other things that go with the delusion. So with delusions, it is a belief, and it's very real, and it's held, and it impacts people's lives. For example, I've known of cases in which individual...
Again, I object to the narrative.
Well, I'm going to sustain that objection. Counselor, you have a right to ask her questions. She has an opportunity to respond to the questions that you put to her. So sustain. So they can just come on and have a seat, Mr. Deputy. Anybody can sit down, and can sit anywhere you want to, with the exception of the front row.
When you talked about highly resistant to change, can you tell me what you mean by that?
Delusions are when somebody is delusional and or they're hallucinating, when they become psychotic, and they're given, for example, psychotropic medication, antipsychotic medication. What we will see is the hallucinations will tend to resolve. The medication will actually oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes get to the point where the voices will hear, the visions will cease completely. Delusions might or might not disappear. They are highly resistant to change. It is as strong as this. I am sitting here right now, and I testify that I was a forensic psychologist. It's very possible. Well, it's not very possible, but let's say that in fact I was delusional. I could be sitting here telling you that I am a forensic psychologist. I am Dr. Flores. I graduated from Miami University. I can give you the years. And you can know that in fact I am homeless, and there is no way that I am Dr. Flores, because I don't even have, you know that I don't even have a high school education, so how could I possibly be Dr. Flores? But to me, I could be sitting here with the certainty that I've testified to, telling you, this is who I am, and you can try to convince me that it's impossible, because I don't even have a high school diploma. You can try to convince me, Dr. Flores, how can you be Dr. Flores making all this money but you're homeless? And I will come up with some rationale, some explanation for why in fact you're wrong, I'm right. My belief is very real, and that is what a delusion is. It is as real as you all know, as everybody here knows, whether they are male or female. Somebody can try to convince you that you're not that gender. Not likely to happen. It's the same thing with a delusion.
Can you tell me what ideas of reference are?
Right. One of the things that I think really contributes to the cementing of an illogical, irrational, makes no sense belief is that with a delusion, individuals will experience what we call in psychology ideas of reference. So if we go back to the example of let's say the neighbor that thinks that they're being poisoned, that thinks that the neighbor is poisoning them, is trying to harm them in some way. If they go outside their house, as an example, and a new neighbor down the street has moved in, and he's having a conversation with the neighbor. Let's say I'm the one that's thinking that I'm being poisoned, and I see the neighbor that I think is poisoning me, and he's pointing at me. I'm pretty sure he's pointing at me, but in fact, that's not what's happening. In fact, what I don't know is happening is that the neighbor is pointing not at me, but is pointing at the direction, trying to tell the neighbor that just moved in how to get to the closest Kroger. But they're pointing in my direction, and my delusional lens doesn't recognize that pointing in my direction could be completely nothing. I am interpreting it through my delusional lens as it is completely directly correlated to him wanting to poison me. I am thinking he's telling me, maybe, that he gave me the brownies that are poisoned. So what happens with ideas of reference is that when individuals are experiencing a delusion, they will hear things and they will see things, and their perception is completely off. They are operating through this delusional lens, and that is how they are going to interpret things going on around them, especially if it's things that are directly tied in to their delusion.
And when someone has a delusion, would the delusion affect a person's ability to plan or implement a complex project?
It depends. There are two different types of delusions. Some individuals experience what we call bizarre delusions. Bizarre delusions would be something that is not only implausible, but impossible. So if somebody is presenting, let's say, with a delusion that they have some sort of implanted device in their head that their thoughts could be read, okay? That might be noticeable because you might actually, it could impact their behavior to the point that you could see that they're just kind of nuts because, they don't want, no, don't talk to me right now. They can hear you. And so those types of delusions, if it's particularly a bizarre delusion, those are the delusions that tend to be more noticeable. But if it's a non-bizarre delusion, and in other words, that's a delusion that it's a belief, it's irrational, it's illogical, it's impossible, but maybe not implausible, not necessarily. So there are individuals that can function extremely well for years with, and I've seen these individuals even outside of forensic settings where they'll function, and in fact they are delusional about something, but they are going on through life and nobody really realizes that the delusion is there. And what's also important is, for the reason that I said before, they don't believe that they're experiencing a delusion. They don't think there's anything wrong with them because they don't realize it.
Now, in Mr. Newman's case, was he having bizarre or non-bizarre delusions?
He was having non-bizarre delusions in the sense that clearly when I looked at them, they don't make sense. But they would be more non-bizarre delusions.
And is there anything about having the type of delusion that he had that would prevent Mr. Neuman from carefully planning or carrying out a project?
No, there is not. Individuals, when delusion is the primary symptom that they're experiencing, they can function like they normally function, and you wouldn't see it differently. In Mr. Newman's case, he was an operations manager. Planning, organizing, all of that is second nature to him, and that's what I would expect to see even if he was delusional.
Okay. Would a coworker or a friend be able to tell if someone had the type of delusion that he had?
No.
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation.
Sustained. Rephrase.
Is there anything about the type of delusion, that the non-bizarre delusion that he had, that would be obvious?
No, not obvious at all. No.
And you said the person that with the delusion doesn't know they have the delusion?
That is correct. It's going back to the example that I used before, where I'm saying I'm a forensic psychologist. If I wasn't a forensic psychologist, I wouldn't know that I was a forensic psychologist because I'm convinced that I am.
Okay. Now, on this chart, you've got some types of delusions. Can you explain what erotomanic delusions are?
Sure. So there are multiple types of delusions. I alluded to paranoid delusions. There's two different types of delusions. One of them is called erotomanic delusions, and that is when an individual's delusion is comprised of irrational, romantic beliefs about their relationship with somebody else. So they believe that the quality of the relationship, the type of relationship that they have with somebody that they are romantically involved with, is much more than it is. In other words, somebody else would say, no, that's not really that's not really the relationship that you have. But to them, again, it feels like that's the reality. And then the rescue delusion is something that we sometimes see particularly in manic episodes of individuals with bipolar disorder, where they will experience an irrational belief that somebody is in danger and they need protection. And this goes with and the reason why we tend to see it more in the manic episode is because I spoke earlier about the grandiosity that can occur when an individual is in a manic episode. And when they have that grandiosity, one of the things that sometimes you will see is the rescue type of delusion come on.
And these two types, the erotomanic and the rescue delusion, are those both found in the DSM-4?
Yes, the DSM talks about both of them.
Does the DSM also talk about delusional disorder?
It does. And delusional disorder is part of, it's basically the delusions that I talked about. And apart from the direct impact, psychosocial functioning is not markedly impaired. Behavior is not going to appear bizarre or non-bizarre, especially if the individual is experiencing what we call a non-bizarre delusion. They're going to appear normal. The only way that you might tell that an individual is experiencing a delusion, if you're not somebody like me, a clinician, and actually looking for different stuff, if you're just a layman individual, the only way that you might be able to tell is, and we call it when you're knocking in the delusion. So if, for example, with the erotomanic delusion, the recipient of that delusion, if you will, may be able to recognize it. So they may see that something is off about this person that they're having a romantic relationship with, because they're seeing the relationship as something that it's not, or they're saying things that are not making that much sense about the relationship.
And does a delusion have to be something that the person wants or believes or wishes was true?
No, they do not. Sometimes the delusions are such that they're opposite of what they want. A mother can kill their child because they're experiencing a paranoid delusion about the child, and kill their child, and it's obviously not what they want. And then they end up getting very sick and experiencing depression and whatnot once they come out of the psychosis and they realize they've killed their child. So delusions can be really dangerous, and they can be something that the individual would not want, and it clearly is not in their best interest.
Okay. And can you read what the DSM says about normal behavior and delusional disorder?
At the bottom?
Yes.
Similarly, a common characteristic of individuals with delusional disorder is the apparent normality of their behavior and appearance when their delusional ideas are not being discussed or acted upon. And the only time that you would see them discussed or acted upon would be, obviously, when they're acting on them, or when they're discussing it in a context, for example, if we go back to erotomanic delusion, if they're talking to the person that they have the delusion about.
Is there also a type of delusion of hypersexuality?
Hypersexuality is not a delusion. It's one of the symptoms that can occur during a manic episode, where it's that whole thing of being really focused on a particular activity. And if it's sex, then individuals can experience hypersexuality, where they are having lots and lots and lots of sex, or indiscriminate sex with people that they ordinarily would not have sex with, or lots of masturbation. They just cannot get enough of it.
And is that something that is an issue in this case?
It is. There is indication of hypersexuality in this case.
Can you tell me how that comes up?
Explain the question. What do you mean how that comes up?
Can you tell me where you see hypersexuality in this case?
Okay, so in this case, we see hypersexuality as reported by Mr. Neuman. Multiple times he's experienced episodes of hypersexuality. We also see it documented in some treatment records.
Lawyers, approach the bench. Oh, we're back in session. You may continue.
Dr. Flores, you've studied all the documents related to Hemy's life experiences. Was there ever a diagnosis prior to this event? Was he ever diagnosed as bipolar?
No, he was not.
Is that uncommon for bipolar disorder to go undiagnosed?
It is not actually, not for bipolar disorder. Individuals can go undiagnosed until they die in their old age, and certainly we see individuals diagnosed in their 60s for the first time. Part of the reason why bipolar goes undiagnosed so frequently is because of the symptoms that the individual experiences. Unless they experience a really debilitating episode like a suicidal.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the speculation as to why individuals are not diagnosed if they in fact are not. That was not the question. This is just a narrative answer.
Sustained. Ask her another question.
Why is it? Why would an individual not be diagnosed with bipolar as opposed to other mental disorders?
The symptoms can actually be really beneficial, especially if they are in a manic episode. Lots of energy, high sexual drive, no need for sleep. You can accomplish lots of things, and so it's being sort of in this natural high. I don't know anybody that would want to get rid of that type of feeling, and so it's typical of individuals who experience primarily the manic episodes, more so than the depressive episodes, to go undiagnosed for that reason, because the symptoms actually, in some ways, help them achieve more than when they are not symptomatic.
Okay. Are there well-known people that the jury would recognize with bipolar disorder?
Objection.
What's the objection?
Object to the relevance of that.
Ms. Sands, why is that relevant to, I heard a question, or whatever, well-known people with a certain disorder. Why is that relevant?
If I can ask one more question leading
I'm
up.
going to sustain the objection. It's not relevant at this point in time.
Just yes or no, would it be helpful for the jury to understand the disease to know other well-known people who suffer from it?
I object, Your Honor. I object to that, and I also object to the lack of foundation of this witness unless she was a treating physician to any of the individuals Ms. Sampson is referring to.
Sustain. Rephrase.
Your Honor, where I'm going with that question
No,
is just
rephrase.
yes.
I didn't ask for an explanation. Sustain. Next question.
Can you explain why that would be helpful to have examples?
I object to the relevance.
Sustain. Rephrase.
Let's talk about malingering. You mentioned that earlier. Can you tell me what malingering means?
Sure. Malingering is when an individual attempts to portray symptoms, psychological problems and symptoms that they really do not have, or if they do have psychological symptoms and problems, malingering could also take the form of exaggerating a level of severity. So that is what malingering is.
And what experience do you have with diagnosing and detecting malingering?
Extensive experience. In any forensic case, malingering must be taken into account, because the other part of malingering is that the reason why the individual is malingering is for some sort of secondary gain, for some sort of purpose. And whether it's a civil matter and somebody's trying to get, let's say, Social Security disability benefits or workers' compensation benefits, or in a criminal matter where somebody's trying to evade incarceration, malingering must be taken into consideration, which is why forensic psychologists would be hired in those types of cases as opposed to clinical psychologists, because of the expertise that we bring in to assessing whether or not somebody's symptoms are valid.
And is malingering something you look for in every forensic assessment that you do?
Every single one of them, yes.
And how many forensic assessments would you say you've done?
By now, thousands.
How do you determine if an individual is malingering?
There are multiple ways. The first one is if their presentation is not typical to what I would know is actually mental illness. If they are reporting symptoms that make no sense, that are clearly not those symptoms that a person with a genuine mental illness would have, or we could also detect it with psychological tests. We actually have in forensic psychology a number of psychological tests that we could administer to detect whether, to help inform us about whether somebody perhaps is malingering psychiatric problems or what we call cognitive impairment. Sometimes individuals will attempt to make themselves appear less smart than they are or have some memory issues. And so we have different types of malingering measures. The other way that we detect malingering is if we do not have what we call corroborating data, corroborating information. So if the individual is reporting some information that at face value appears logical, makes sense, then malingering could also be detected if in fact let's say somebody is, for example, saying that in fact they were diagnosed with a specific illness and that they were hospitalized at Georgia Regional Hospital in the year 2000. And I asked for the records from Georgia Regional Hospital from the year 2000, and there is no such hospitalization because the person was never hospitalized. Well, right there we have information that tells me, there's some deception here about the psychological problems that they're detecting. So I'm looking for, I will call family members to determine whether or not they have noticed the symptoms that the person is reporting. So there's different ways to detect malingering, and a forensic psychologist does not ever just use one. It's multiple ways that we sort of arrive at a decision of whether or not a diagnosis is valid or whether or not we think that there's sufficient evidence to call it malingering.
Okay. And is that why you had to review so many records in this case and talk to so many people?
It is. It's part of the reason, yes.
Let's talk about the testing piece of it. Did you do any psychological testing in this case?
I did.
What was, can you tell the jury what the first test you did was?
The very first one is basically a screener. It's called a mini mental state exam. It's 30 items. It's administered over about 5-7 minutes, and it informs me in terms of, is the person oriented to date, time, person, situation. There is a brief memory test, so it informs me as to whether or not there may be any memory issues with the individual. They're asked to write a sentence, so that also informs me in terms of even their educational level, in terms of whether maybe I need to pursue some specific kind of test. So it's a screener, and I administered that to Mr. Neuman, and he obtained a perfect score on it, which basically indicated that he was, when I met with him, he was fully oriented to who he was, where we were, who I was, what the purpose of the evaluation was, his memory. At the time, his immediate memory and memory on 5 minutes later was intact, and I didn't notice any issues with his ability to communicate with me.
Okay. And what was the next test you gave him?
I gave him, I don't remember if this was the actual order, but another test that I gave him is called the Milan multi-axial clinical inventory, and I gave him, there's 3 different editions. It's been revised a couple of times, so I gave him the 3rd one.
Okay. And can you explain to the jury a basic understanding of what that test is for and how it works?
Sure. The MCMI-3 is what it's called, is it's a self-report test. It is one of those where there's a Scantron sheet and you fill in whether it's true or false. And it consists of 175 items. They're all true and false. And the purpose of this any psychiatric disorder or personality disorder.
Okay. And does that relate back to what you were talking about with malingering?
It does. It is. It's another piece. It's another piece of data. It's about adding to that bucket of what data do I have and where do I put it? Do I put it in malingering or do I put it in a valid diagnosis? And so. So taking a look at that, specifically with Mr. Neuman, first of all, the validity indicator actually indicated that he was underreporting. So there was no indication of malingering. It was actually contrary to that. He was actually underreporting. He was actually trying to make himself look as better psychologically put together than he really was. And the symptoms that were there, even with the underreporting, were consistent with some mania and with some anxiety. And then in terms of personality, there were some narcissistic traits that were elevated.
Okay. And specifically looking at the scores for bipolar, how did he score?
He scored. That was one of the highest scores that he obtained, and by that I mean that it fell in the clinical. There's cutoffs of where. So the level of manic symptoms that he was reporting was actually put him at what we call in the clinical area. In other words, where you would actually see potential diagnoses. Obviously, I wouldn't just diagnose just based on an MCMI, otherwise there would be no need for psychologists if you could just give a test. But it is another piece of data to consider.
Okay. And then you said he also scored in the for anxiety?
Yes, the anxiety clinical scale piece was also elevated, and that's not unusual in individuals that are in the current legal situation that he's in.
Okay. Are there reasons other than a mental disorder why he might score highly under anxiety?
Well, the fact that he has a legal problem. So it's not atypical in criminal forensic cases to see some anxiety on the MCMI because of the legal issues that are involved. Individuals are often nervous about it.
Okay. And are the results of bipolar or anxiety, as opposed to another mental disorder, results you would expect from someone who's malingering?
Not from somebody who is. Can somebody malinger bipolar disorder? Potentially. In this case, again, it's one of those things where I'm looking at, is the presentation that I'm seeing on the MCMI consistent with what I'm seeing elsewhere? And it was not consistent with malingering. He could have, for example, also elevated other things like schizophrenia, and he didn't. And as I mentioned before, he was actually underreporting.
Okay. And you mentioned narcissistic traits.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. Narcissistic traits is when somebody has sort of an inflated sense of self. And again, it's one of those things that research tells us that we tend to see individuals endorse some of the items on these personality tests like the MCMI that might appear to be narcissistic. Particularly if they are experiencing a manic episode, it takes us right back to that whole grandiosity. If one of the symptoms that they're experiencing is grandiosity as part of their manic episode, they're thinking that they're better and they're bigger, and so you're going to see that come across on the MCMI when they're marking questions about how good they think they are. So it's not atypical at all to see narcissism, and in fact, research also informs us that about 1 in 20 individuals with bipolar disorder, if you give them something like one of these personality inventories that assesses narcissism, you're going to see some of those traits, particularly if they are experiencing a manic episode.
And are narcissistic traits something that you only see in people with a mental disorder?
No. There are many individuals that are, first of all, he does not have a narcissistic personality disorder. That would have taken it to a completely different realm. There was some indication of some narcissistic traits, that whole inflated self. But no, in terms of narcissism, you see them in individuals that are clearly not suffering from mental illness. There are subgroups in which you actually expect to see narcissism, like politicians, for example, or surgeons. Those are some individuals that if you were to give them a personality test, you're going to see some narcissistic traits, not because they're manic and grandiose, but because they actually have an inflated sense of self because of everything that they've accomplished.
So would it be unusual for someone who is highly educated, extremely successful in a demanding field to have narcissistic traits?
It would not at all.
And have there been any studies on how common it is to see narcissistic traits in someone who's bipolar?
Yes, there have been studies, and you see it about. There actually is what we call comorbidity, which means that you tend to see an overlap, particularly if you're evaluating a person when they are experiencing one of these hypomanic or manic episodes, that you will also tend to see some of the narcissistic traits present. So you tend to see both of those together, particularly when they are experiencing a manic episode. Not so much if they're experiencing a depressive episode, because as I said before, with a depressive episode, they would be feeling worthless and whatnot, and so that would be inconsistent with them endorsing those narcissistic traits then.
Does the presence of narcissistic traits tell you anything about the likelihood of malingering?
No, it does not. Individuals can malinger whether they have narcissistic traits or no narcissistic traits. It has nothing to do with the other.
Now, your diagnosis of Hemy Neuman is bipolar 1, correct?
That is correct.
And it's not narcissistic personality disorder?
That is correct. In my opinion, he does not have the criteria on the DSM for narcissistic personality disorder.
Okay. So what was the ultimate conclusion from this test?
From this test, it basically informed me that my impressions were really not off. That my opinion from my interview of him, that he appeared to have some indication of bipolar disorder, was consistent with what I obtained. This was another piece of data that gave me some additional information that I was on the right track, if you will, in terms of my diagnosis. Okay.
And I think you touched on this, but can you diagnose someone from this test?
You cannot, and you should not. Because, again, it's only one piece of information. You never should diagnose just based on a test.
Okay. Let's talk about the next test you gave. What was that?
It's called the MFAST, and it is a test specifically that looks at malingering.
You said MFAST?
MFAST, Miller Forensic Assessment of Symptoms Test.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a break, and we will pick back up on the MFAST test. It'll be 10 minutes. I try to give you a regular hour. So just in case you have any questions, pick it up. All right.